Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in layers of turbulence and consequential activity like never before. you know, well, I shouldn't say that. There's always past history has been calamitous as well, but right now we have so many things going on at the same time. Climate change is on a time scale that makes it push to the back of our minds, um, especially when there's real time atrocities related to migrants, related to countries at war, related to American governance or misgovernance. This is Andy Revkin, a Sustain What webcast with Paul Hawken, who I've known for a couple of decades and have admired for longer than that, and through my journalism and general inquiry on how we journey on this planet. He's been a touchstone. And he has a new book out, and we're going to kind of go through a bit of his learning journey through books, kind of as touchstones. And the latest one is got a very simple title, Carbon. It's the book of life, and it's about how the unique nature of Earth, compared to just about anything in the known universe, for its carbonaceous qualities, which have led us to all kinds of conundrums, including putting too much into the atmosphere so quickly, and how that relates to what we do and don't do going forward. Paul, it's really good to be connected to you again. It's been a while since we've been in the same place, face to face. But here we are in Maine, and are you home in California, Northern California, or north of the?
Yeah, it's really good to see you. I'm trying to think when we first met. I was very impressed. I think you were working for the Times then, and
Yeah.
said, geez, this guy knows a lot about climate and the environment. Oh, okay.
I'm always just trying to figure it all out. So
yeah,
I think that's what we all are. And then things get disrupted, and new knowledge comes around, and you.
Mm-hmm.
In journalism, you can get locked into a certain way of thinking about a story or an issue, and narrative capture, I'd call it. And I try to break free of that. The blogging I did after my conventional reporting at the Times, I think, led me to more dimensions of how to think about things.
Yeah,
you've had a remarkable journey, and we'll talk a little bit about, even as a 19-year-old, you worked with Martin Luther King and those trying to create civil rights in the United States. And then you got into things related to agriculture and business, and you thrived in that world with Smith and Hawken, which I remember as a younger person being a pretty cool enterprise. And your first books were on issues like how do you build a business that doesn't impede planetary prosperity and the like. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that early part of your journey. Just sort of, how did you become that? And then we'll go quickly forward.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's, how did I start writing? First of all, I don't really know. My mom says that when I was 6 years old, I said I was going to grow up and be a writer. I think that might be apocryphal. I don't think I remember that. I never ever said that. Mm-hmm. It's a mom's. For me, I think the real turning point, Andy, was asthma, because I had it from 6 months until I was 18 years old. And in order to play sports, which I loved, in junior high school and high school, I had to take drugs every day, amenophen and ephedrine, which is not even legal anymore because it contains ephedra, which is a stimulant. And I had to take 3 different prescriptions, 3 different doctors, because I was taking the maximum dose from each doctor. And so that was my upbringing, in a sense that I had to be medicated in order to play basketball and breathe and all that sort of stuff. And there was no relief forthcoming from the medical establishment. And when I was 18, I read a book that said, if you're sick, it's your fault. And I was kind of a little like F you, you know, I had it from 6 months old, at, you know, the youngest case ever recorded in Mills Hospital in San Mateo. But really what it was saying, it's your responsibility. And that made sense to me. In other words, no one else is going to fix it for you.
Right.
And so I went on a food fast for a 10-day food fast, just rice and tea. And on the 8th day, I could breathe for the first time in my life without medication. I felt air at the bottom of my lungs, which is a sensation everyone has. They don't recognize it because they've had their whole life.
Right.
Most people. And I was startled at how quickly all the symptoms went away, and the breathing difficulties, and no more medication.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went back to those 3 different doctors and said, guess what, you know, and they really weren't interested. They pretty much said, dismissed it and thought it was psychosomatic, and went on. And that shocked me, really. But I knew then that I had to change my diet. And so what happened, I added one food after another, and one single food. And then I could feel it, apple juice, beer, you know, hamburger, things that I was eating then, you know, I could feel right away its impact upon the body. And so I began to say, I can eat this, I can eat lentils, I can eat green vegetables, I can eat this, I can eat that. I can't eat that. That does not work for my body.
Right.
And pretty soon I was going to Chinatown, Japantown, the farmer's market, the Quaker mill, you know, it's all around town to get the different things that I was eating. I couldn't get it from one store. And that actually eventually became the birth of Erewhon, you know, the company.
Right.
And that's a food company. Because I thought you should be able to go to one store and get what you need. Basically, you know, it wasn't a farmer's market at first. We didn't have produce, but later did. And, but it really made me look at the whole so-called medical food, agricultural health establishment in the United States, which still exists to this very day. And I think the second turning point was when somebody came to the store and said, how do you know your oats are organic? Because I was saying organic oats, you know, and how do you know your oil is cold pressed? And fair questions, which I thought were silly because the label on the oil said cold pressed and it's from Hain. And the oats came from the Mennonites in Pennsylvania. And I said, hey, these are Mennonites, come on, you know. And so right quickly thereafter, somebody, the oats came in a big bobtail, you know, we had to kind of grab the bag, you know, you put your arms on this Bemis bag. And there was a label staring at me as I took it downstairs into the store, all 4 bags, and it said National Oat Company, Des Moines, Iowa. Huh. That's fine.
Yeah. And
so I got information, called them up, got a really nice woman. And she said, how can I help you, honey? I said, tell me about your organic farming program. And she said, huh? And I said, you know, organic agriculture. She said, will you all explain that to me? And I explained it to her. She said, oh, gosh, you know, we just buy oats and roll them here. That's all we do. And I said, oh, okay. And then same with the oil. Hain wrote to me and said, there's no such thing as cold pressed oil. It's all solvent extracted. It kind of refers to cold processing, which means we cool it down and take the stearates off so the oil is clear. And it pissed me off. I felt I was lying to my customer, you know, unintentionally, of course, but so were food companies at that time, even early on in the organic food movement. People were BSing. And so I probably would have left that little store because I was more interested in reading and doing other things. And I decided to replace everything in the store with a product that I knew was organic. And I began to go to farms all across the country and visit farmers and talk to them who were organic or biodynamic farmers. And I learned so much about agriculture in the United States. I mean, it was just a tutorial on, and most of these were men at that time, and they, they had never not been an organic farmer, put it that way. They just did
Right.
after the war. And so that was the birth of Erewhon. And that, then, Smith and Hawken really came out of gardening, which is sort of an outgrowth of that, how to grow your own food, really, or among other things. And so did the Ecology of Commerce. And those books really came out of being in business and then looking at it again with sort of new eyes.
Yeah.
And seeing what we know today, which is business tends to be extraordinarily extractive, exploitative, and not, if you could say, not responsible in the true sense of the word. Although many businesses believe they are, and I don't doubt their sincerity, but the effect on the environment was not that. And,
You're reminding me of some years ago, 10 years ago, 11 years ago. Agriculture Secretary at the time was pushing the idea of improved information on products. So what you were talking about, that learning curve where you started to try to figure out, well, what actually is organic? What is, where did these oats come from? I think there still can be a possibility of much more sort of imposable transparency, and or at least for companies that want to link you to the information on anything you see, whether your interest is organic or just, slave labor or whatever, that we might have the capacity to do those things more than we ever did. There's a big section in your new book, Carbon, on food. And but it's like social media and everything else. It takes a motivated consumer. You have to be, you have to want to know where things came from. And we could talk more about that, how you imbue people with that zeal. Like in this piece, I wrote that the reason there's mango juice is my son, who was like 14 at the time. We liked to get mango juice. We both liked it. And I'd never said, and then I looked at the label and it's from Belgium. I thought, okay, that's a learning moment. How did what's the supply chain there? How does that mango juice how do the mangoes get to Belgium, et cetera? And so you're onto something there. And, that's one of the communication challenges isn't so much telling a better story as just inspiring people to want to know.
Yeah.
Does that feel right?
Yeah. I think the real breakthrough book was the Ecology of Commerce, though, because nobody put business and ecology together, and it showed.
And that's the one. That's like a textbook, right? Or it's been taught.
No, Ecology of Commerce was.
No, it
was a regular book. It was actually a New York Times bestseller. But it's interesting because I had been positively reviewed by every book I had done to that point in the business press and things like that. And this time I got hammered, the Ecology of Commerce, both by the environmental side. NRDC wrote a scathing review of it. It wasn't reviewed by any business publications. Actually was reviewed. The editors killed the reviews. Only one person reviewed it in the United States. I got one review, and it's a positive review, but it still became a bestseller. But the attitude, both on the commercial side and on the environmental side, was that the business was a problem, and business said environmentalists are the problem. It's like, of course,
right,
that polarity, and it's even worse today with Trump, excising the word climate everywhere in any government literature or websites. But at that time, that polarity was certainly very, very powerful. Yeah. And
amazing.
Commerce, and then Blessed Unrest, which sort of is echoed a little bit in the new book, Carbon, the Book of Life, and we can go back to that when we talk about the Book of Life.
Yeah. This line related to this book resonates an awful lot right now. Humanity's immune response to toxins like political corruption, economic disease, and ecological degradation. I mean, just think about that. And are we seeing maybe the white cells? I won't put a color on it, the immune system with the hands-off protests and maybe kicking into gear a little bit?
Again, we are. We saw them. We saw them before, and I would say that one thing we don't see that exists actually is communities all around the world that are expressing regenerative principles in socially, culturally, agriculturally, in all other ways, as step by step, not totally. They're working with what is, but what we see and hear and read are all the things that light up our amygdala, and that's click through for the media and these communities around the world, and there's 10,000 of them. I mean, they're all over, and we don't know about them. I don't know about them. I just keep connecting or bumping into them or hearing about or reading about them or being connected by people in them. And I'm just marveling at the rate at which humanity is trying to address, ecological degradation, degeneration, exploitation, extraction, etc. in the world today. And again, it doesn't make the news. It's not a news item. It's just like, right. It's something, like Dan Barber, up in New York State. Oh, Dan Barber. He's wonderful, by the way. I'm not saying that, but I mean, unless it's photogenic and mediagenic, right. You don't hear about it. And
there are some. God, it was maybe 15 years ago. I started citing this thing called digital green, which is a way to foster farmer to farmer, community to community communication around practices that sustain livelihoods and environments. And it's still going strong. But what's interesting about it is it's the antithesis of news in the sense that
right.
There are films they create little YouTube videos in local languages. So a farmer in rural India can explain why a particular planting practice is better than another one. And it's got all that community value, but it does have an online quality too.
Right.
But again, you have to look for it. It's not like you're not going to read about it in the
right. And what dominates the news, which is fear, threat, lies, just outrageousness, or glamour or beauty or scandal. And the media, without even making it a policy, moves to that automatically because that feeds them with click-throughs.
Tell me about
it. And that click-through means your interest in that subject has now been captured by Google and sold basically to advertisers and say, oh, that looks like a good customer for whatever. And what we don't understand, because we talk about, industry being extractive, probably the most extractive industry in the United States is Google.
Sure.
It's taking every scrap and shred of information that comes from everybody in the world that is using Google and then consolidating it and reselling it to people who want to sell you something, a service or a product.
I remember around 2008 at the New York Times when they were really struggling because of the ad revenue being siphoned away. There was some chatter in the newsroom. Oh, maybe Google will buy us. There were rumors floating around, but of course, they don't have to buy the New York Times. They're already mining the content for all the value, and then we had to borrow money from Carlos Slim in Mexico, the billionaire and stuff. And the Times now is kind of thriving, but it's thriving mainly on what you're talking about.
Yeah,
it's not.
Yeah,
it's just.
Yeah, I read it, but I also, not because of the reportage. The journalists in the Times are extraordinary. Not because of the reportage, but what's being reported. It's almost like you have to take a second shower in the morning. It's like, whoa, let's move on.
Yeah. So you did these two books, and I was just reading the acknowledgments in your new book, Carbon, and you actually had the contract to write Carbon first, but you wanted to get these concepts out there. And Drawdown, of course, has become an enduring project more than a book, and it really owes its whole roots to your thinking. I remember we went back and forth a little bit early on when you were pulling that together, and it was sort of a community exercise in pulling together best practices. And the word solutions is kind of laden, but pathways, strategies for turning things around.
Yeah, I mean, Drawdown started in 2001 when the third assessment came out from the IPCC, and like you and people interested in climate, you read the summary. You can't read the whole thing; it's just voluminous, and each is more dire. But the thing about the IPCC summary reports or the reports themselves is that they are consensus science,
right?
And there's no such thing as consensus science. And there's the only thing that should be consensual is sex, but not science. And which means it was tamped down by Russia or Soviet Union at that time. But I mean, Russia,
Saudi Arabia.
But Saudi Arabia and the United States and et cetera, the oil OPEC nations, really tamped down, the concerns and the warnings really that was coming from Group 1 and the IPCC. And Group 3 was tamping it down and talking about solutions. And so you could read between the lines, and I'm sure you did too. And then I started to wonder then why we didn't know, and I use the word solutions now, why people didn't know what to do. And there were silly things out there about what to do, like I won't name the organizations because I respect them, but they were saying use cold water in your washing machine and power strip in your home entertainment center, and things like this, which are just like staggering in their how diminutive they were compared to the task at hand. And that's when I went to institutions, NGOs, and others. I don't know if I spoke to you then, but about saying we need to map, measure, and model, not just suggest or idea, but model accurately what would be the greatest set of solutions to reverse global warming. In other words, can we please name the goal? The goal is not net zero, which is an impossibility anyway, but we'll talk about that. But the goal is to reverse it, and having net zero, mythically at 2050 means that ppm would be 520, 510, 515. We don't know, but around the 500s. And so that's drawdown. So that's why I use the term drawdown.
Right.
And although I authored the book, I put edited because we got researchers from around the world, docs and postdocs from different universities who volunteered to do the research on each solution that had come up, and more than 100 had come up, but we were looking for about 100. We did 80 eventually, and 20 more that were in a sense proposed, like these are great solutions, but we just don't have the data on them. They're too nascent. And so that's how Drawdown emerged. But I use edited because I want to make sure that everybody got credit, not just me, if you know what I mean. Like, and so though I authored it, I feel like I really was, just buoyed up by all the research that had done by these 60 some odd researchers around the world. And yeah, it's a platform, but it also unintentionally became the birth of solutionism, and which is this idea that we have solutions to the problem, and that we don't really look at the narrative. You mentioned that earlier, but we're not really looking at the climate narrative, and because I think the climate narrative is actually drastically incorrect, in my opinion. But that, before I set pen to paper on Drawdown, I knew I was going to do regeneration, because I knew then that the path through wasn't solutionism. I'm not saying the solutions are not tenable and should be done. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying the path forward for civilization is to create more life on Earth. The biosphere creates the atmosphere, always has, and one species, has decided to dysregulate, the atmosphere and climate. But that doesn't mean that in itself is going to be, if you fix that, quote, that's going to solve the problem. It will not. And the only way you can actually create an enduring civilization is to create more life on Earth, given what we've done the last 500 years.
And then comes Carbon, the book that just came out a month or so ago. This line is interesting. A broken planet lies before us, but there's also a buzzing, thrumming, thriving sphere imbued with imagination, mystery, and courage. These pages are a journey into the realm of plants, the cosmos of insects, labyrinths of fungi, droves of mammals, spinneys of trees, and convocations of human brilliance. The flow of carbon is a sacred dance that entwines and weaves through all our stories. And you start to go past the sort of the villainization of carbon, which I think has been an intent of a lot of environmentalists lately, just saying it's a misrepresentation of the dynamics that need to be addressed. Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah, I mean, that goes back to what I was saying about the climate narrative. The climate narrative emerged, I think, from science originally. I was schooled in this, I don't know, 40 plus years ago at Stanford Research Institute. And I think what science, I can't speak for scientists, but my guess is that they were sort of trying to warn us about what was happening and what would happen if we continued to increase our carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And it really wasn't paid much attention to. And so they began to ratchet up the rhetoric, in terms of fear, threat, existential threat, etc., and move much more to fear, and that actually didn't really work, because people don't move to fear, they don't move to restriction, they don't move to threat, they move to possibility. That's human nature. And then I think that rhetoric and that whole thing got taken over by NGOs that amplified it, and then eventually by entrepreneurs who said, let's make money reversing global warming, or whatever term they used. And to me, we just have a mess in terms of belief systems and rhetoric and technologies, that some of which, like direct air capture, are so absurd that any ninth grader who studied the second law of thermodynamics will tell you that direct air capture will never work, So that's kind of where we are. And so, yeah, carbon, villainizing it, basically, and again, the verbs, these are very male verbs from my gender, but combat, tackle, fight, climate change are just ridiculous statements. First of all, climate is supposed to change. Okay. It does every millisecond. So let's put that aside. And fighting it is like trying to be Don Quixote, you can't fight it. And so, but what it represents is an objectification of the living world, of climate, quote, quote, of the atmosphere, of carbon, particularly, like the bad boy in this mix is carbon. It's not phosphorus, it's not zinc, it's not sodium, it's carbon. And somehow we've got to control it and do this and capture it and bury it, all these sort of things, that mindset, Andy, is the mindset that caused the problem. It's the objectification of the living world. And once you objectify it, and that includes people, by the way, and cultures, then you can take whatever you want. And that's what Western societies have been doing for 500 years, is selling the living world to the highest bidder. And somehow now we've got offsets and nature-based solutions, and we're selling those to the highest bidder. It's the same mindset that caused the problem.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little more, because in some other sections of the book you get into this. You also have a section of the book, as we were saying earlier, on the media and the cavernous psychological dark hole called the climate emergency is occupied primarily by scientists, activists, the media, and sprinkling of politicians and traumatized youth. But it's a tiny, tiny, tiny little black hole. It's a minutia part of this bigger landscape of what people are talking about and worrying about. Yeah. And when I was reading it, I was remembering, this used to be a slide of mine when Justice Scalia, when he was alive on the Supreme Court, during the discussions way back when, in making CO2 a pollutant under the Clean Air Act, he said this great thing. The Massachusetts Attorney General was making the case for this details related to the stratosphere or the troposphere. And Scalia says, troposphere, whatever. I told you before, I'm not a scientist. And then there was laughter in the transcript. That's why I don't want to have to deal with global warming, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
I think he was speaking for a lot of people, including people in the environmental movement who recognize the wicked nature of the problem.
Yeah.
And yeah, I love how the laughter is in the transcript, the official transcript. Because people were saying, yeah, troposphere, whatever. So tell me about that chunk of the book.
Well, I just feel like, again, the communication that issues forth continuously to this day guarantees that 99+% of all people on Earth don't do anything about on a daily way and daily life about the emissions of carbon in their activity. And so they leave it up to others. And so our communication has guaranteed non-involvement, non-participation, and we can see that. I mean, after 50 years, where are we? How could the end of civilization be so disinteresting to humanity? Well, because that's what we're talking about. And, but even that phrase, ending of civilization, we can't really say that, because it's like, oh, I can't even deal with that. I got a mortgage and kids and the car broke down, So how can you communicate in such a way that it connects to people's real lives, their daily life, their circadian rhythm, and engage them? And the book I'm writing after this, but the book Carbon is about, basically saying that, regeneration is about more, not less. And everything about the climate communication up to now has been about less. And people just don't move to less. But at the same time, the climate establishment, and I consider that to be the renewable energy industry and so forth, has been trotting out this phrase about we're in the energy transition and we're going to do this. And we are not in an energy transition. That is coined by Jimmy Carter, 1974, was it? I don't know, when he spoke on TV with his cardigan, and asked us to turn down the thermostat. There is no energy transition occurring right now. That is nonsense. 20, not even 20% of our energy is electrical. The rest of it is coal, gas, oil, and nuclear. And so we have managed in the last 25 years to go from almost 41% renewable energy in electricity, because there was hydro and nuclear was counted then, and there wasn't so much, obviously, wind and solar at all, to 43% in 2024, from 40 to 43%. Okay. So, and that's of the 20% of our total energy use. So we have to actually step back and say, can we just be honest with each other that our use of coal, gas, and oil are increasing, every century, from the 17th to the 18th to the 19th to the 20th. I say the 17th and the 18th is wood. That was our energy source. And then it went to coal. And then it went to oil. And natural gas is a subset of that. And we use more wood today than the last century. And 20th century used more wood than the 19th century. 19th century used more wood than the 18th century. And so 2.3 billion people in the world today depend on wood every day for heat and food and cooking. And the same thing with coal. We use more coal today, whether it's per month, per capita, or annualized, than we did in the last century, than in the century before, when it was discovered, in the century before. So we are increasing the non-electrical energy. Now put nuclear aside because it obviously produces electricity, but we're increasing them, incredibly by, right up to this day, today. And so then people talk about the energy transition and net zero. What is net zero? The idea that somehow in 2050 there'll be no carbon emissions is just catastrophically wrong. in terms of messaging? You're scratching your head.
No, I had my yeah. No, I was muted because our generator is doing its weekly little quick test. See, we have
Okay. Okay.
we're on solar power through the grid. We have a heat pump, and we have a propane power generator to
Right.
get us through the
Right.
inevitable main storm-driven power outages. It's energy addition is what we've experienced.
Yeah.
It's this reminds me. You mentioned the 2 billion people cooking on wood still, and I did a lot of reporting on that when I was at ProPublica, and there's a phrase among the scientists who study that whole field. You know, how do you cut pollution, indoor pollution, and the health impacts from cooking, and they call it stacking. In the kitchen in Pakistan or rural India, or sub-Saharan Africa, you have wood, and if you have a propane tank, you treat it very preciously. You use it for particular things, and just like we have a grill and a toaster and
Mm.
and a microwave
Right.
and a stove, you know, we have done addition in the kitchen, not just not
Right.
transition. And the same thing with even the induction stovetops are great, but
Yeah.
the ovens are not induction. So it's a long journey decarbonizing. Is the
Well,
reality.
let's take that term. Decarbonizing what? I mean,
Right.
even decarbonization is part of a jargon that is meaningless to people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what does it mean? Decarbon. You have 1.2 trillion carbon atoms in every cell in your body. So let's talk
Right.
about decarb. I mean, it's again, it's one of those phrases that means nothing to people. Like,
Right.
I know it's code language for people who understand, renewables and emissions very well. Don't get me wrong. I know that.
Right.
And it's okay to speak in jargon. Doctors do when doing surgery. They talk in jargon. They don't want to talk in full, complete sentences. There's not enough time.
Right.
And that would hurt the patient. And so I can understand jargon, but to use jargon as a communication vehicle for the mass of humanity is self-defeating.
Right. To think it's going to change things.
Carbon neutrality, net zero,
Right.
decarbonization. It just goes on and on. You go, first of all, they're not true.
Right.
And second of all, just jargon.
Yeah. So in the book, you have substantial sections laying out kind of your vision of using the full system, including living things, all living things, and thinking about the conundrum or the changes that humanity would have to undertake. This is just one little section where you talk about, again, you sort of dismiss the word pollutant appropriately, I think, because we're talking about the bubbles in beer. I took that picture a while back. How does that work? You know, that was the debate that Scalia was involved in. I think it actually is a tough case, even though the Supreme Court did judge in 2007 that under the Clean Air Act, CO2 is a pollutant. I think that's a tough one. And I think Trump will probably have some success in unraveling some of those things. It'll take time. Some of my environmental lawyer colleagues think that it'll be very hard for them to unravel that, but we'll see. So how do you present the alternative picture then? You know, if you're in a room of people drinking a beer and you're trying to make the case for a changed relationship between humans and the climate system, how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, you can't make a case for going the wrong way. He's like, if I'm in a room with people and they're saying, "Oh, make a case for," like, I'm trying to make a case for, like, can we just, put our feet on the ground? We used to say, and I thank my co-author Amory Lovins for this phrase, really, but at Drawdown, in God we trust, all others bring data, and so I'm firmly in the data camp, by the way, and at the same time, I feel like the the expression, the emotions, the feelings, the sorrow, and the grief that human beings feel about the losses that are occurring world over obviously in terms of species environment, but also their children's well-being, their loss of home, their loss of land, their loss of agricultural autonomy, their loss of income, the ravages of increased heating in terms of too little water, too much water, floods and drought. I mean, I could go on, and but there is grief and sorrow, and I think this grief is really, really important, and because grief can only come from love. If you don't love something, you cannot grieve its loss or damage. And so, and love comes from the heart, and the heart is the organ that always tells the truth. And that is being sort of shunted aside or put aside or marginalized and so forth. And in fact, more and more people are feeling grief. I don't have an answer. That is silly, but I would say that when I look at it, to me, because that's what so many books are. Listen up, I know you don't.
Yeah.
Not saying that at all. Please, this is kind of a kind but mutual arrogance about that. Like I got this mission. This is the way. I see stuff that every single day comes across my transom about people saying dun 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 dun.
Yeah.
But to me, it's really about what's the word? Being in touch with oneself, and Carbon, the Book of Life, is really trying to awaken a sense of awe and wonder and amazement about where we live and who we are and who our earthmates are. There's 3.4 trillion creatures here, talking to each other every day, and we think we're until recently the only intelligent one of those 3.4 trillion creatures, 8.4 million species, and now we're realizing, oh no, wait a minute, they have language too. Trees have language, bats have language,
right.
Insects have emotions and feelings. Insects have emotions and feelings. That's just enough. I mean, that's inconceivable to us even 5 years ago, much less 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, or forever. And so the understanding what it is in a human being and who we live with and who, I say who or what, and what is actually creating what we cherish, which is our lives, our food, our family, our community, is being lost in the conversations that are occurring right now. So I'm trying to change the conversation or the awareness, and that's why you get sentences like you're highlighting, which I really appreciate, by the way.
Yeah, you're reminding me of. I recently spoke at a meeting at NYU by this More Than Human Life project, which is one of a number of initiatives, and not just with science, but with the ethical frame, trying to grapple with what this means as we humans develop a clearer, at least a less murky picture of where these lines are that we used to draw very hubristically. With us in one space and the rest of everything in another place. And it's really important discussions.
It is, and that's emblematic. That I read about Moth, but of the again, that separation, that disconnection, that objectification, and that's the cause. It's causal. It's and if you want to go to cure, so to speak, you have to go upstream. You have to go to the river, the fable of the river, which has been around for 1,000 years. But you have to go upstream to first cause. If you're not going there, then you're downstream trying to, we call it end of pipe cleanup. Remember that one? But the whole climate movement is pretty much end of pipe cleanup.
Yeah, that gets back to the hyper focus on CO2 as an emission, a pollutant.
Yeah.
As opposed to you quoted Eric Roston a couple of times from his book on carbon a long time ago on that notion of a dance or a cycle.
Yes.
There's a big section of the book on food and plants and as you said, fungi and other things. which raised questions for me about sort of the landscape from tradition to technology in terms of where we would go from here in dealing with these things. There's some pretty profound lines and data in your book about what we've done to the environment of living things and what to do about it. You talk about a new generation of farmers, chefs, bakers, and makers providing us with pleasure, restoring our taste buds, and regenerating the land with their unstinting and underpaid labor. Reversing global warming requires changing the food we eat. So that's the line. Yeah, there's a big discussion about that point. Is it how much of it's about changing the food? How much of it is about changing our relationship to the land? I was in the Amazon in Belém a year ago, learning about efforts, not just efforts, but dynamics that were changing, basically getting more beef from less land. And, you could say get rid of beef altogether, of course, but that's going to take time. But they were finding ways, intensification of cultivation of cattle can greatly reduce how much forest gets destroyed to make X number of hamburgers. And that's Jesse Ausubel used to make this point too, about it's really land use patterns, which can be abetted by technology or practices, not just tradition. So what's your sense of that? Like I have here a picture of in the oceans, there's a company now making lab grown eel. And I've written about eel conservation, of course, as well. They can both end up with less impact on the things we care about. So is technology in the mix or not?
Yeah, but not cell culture meat, made in big vats that were designed for vaccines. No, I don't see that as the future. First of all, it's too expensive. And
kind of like direct air capture.
Yeah, it's like direct air. Well, yeah, it is. But direct air capture has a different problem. But
yeah.
But in terms of food we eat, and you use the word land use. Can we talk about soil?
Yeah,
that's really where we have to think about, focus on, and basically we're destroying the soil all over by land use, and whether it be cattle or tractors or seeding or soybeans or corn. Mm-hmm. But certainly with obviously NPK fertilizers, neonicotinoids, which is the most prevalent insecticide in the world today, and paraquat and glyphosate. It goes on and on and on. 13,000 different chemicals are used on soil. On soil, come on, 13,000. And so forth. So we have these giant behemoths of organizations, Bayer, Monsanto, and Syngenta, etc., making these things, and then basically, totally dominating the people who are in the USDA, including Tom Vilsack, who I liked, but a good man, and in terms of policy, subsidies, all that sort of stuff, world over. So, and the thing about, and I say, like, all the cultures in the world that we know of called the Earth Mother, there's one ancient Egyptian culture that talked about a male god that was the Earth, okay? But the other 5,000 said Mother Earth, and Madre. They said mother because they knew it gave birth to life. And all life, put the oceans aside for a minute, just land, came from soil. And it still does.
Yeah.
Everything we see comes from the soil, and we're destroying the soil. So that goes to what food we eat. Well, which food, but where did it come from? How is it grown? How is it produced? And the argument about beef, non-beef, and so forth, you got to step back and just say, well, wait a minute. We know one thing, that the grasslands of the world co-evolve with animals. You take the animals off, and that land deteriorates. So let's just put that down as a marker, or and then now let's talk about which animals in the land doing what for whom and where, and then how are they basically managed upon the land? Is it rotational? Is it or otherwise? Do they destroy the land themselves? which they can do, or they can actually regenerate land. And that choice is up to us in terms of how we manage that interrelationship between grazing animals and the grasslands itself. So, I mean, yeah, the food we eat, where did it come from? Who made it? How did they make it? And the fact that organic and biodynamic and food that's raised that way costs more than commercial food is because, obviously, as you have written about too, is because commercial agriculture doesn't have to deal with externalities. It doesn't pay for its damage.
Right.
And organic internalizes those, Yeah.
Yeah. There's a big section of the book on wood and trees and forests, which gets into so many interesting questions. I mentioned the Amazon before. And one thing I think about a lot is the like learning the science of trees. Whoops, sorry. In terms of making new products, that can kind of cut two ways too. There are many examples, like Taxol when we got the breast cancer medication from trees. Wonderful, fantastic. But in the end, it's still exploitative and may not. Then we substitute. We find a way to, as you said earlier, do it in a lab, and you may not still fully value the forest for the trees, that kind of thing. And then, as you were saying earlier, you're kind of like pretty negative in the book on market-based approaches to conservation, certainly carbon. But it still feels like if there were a way to invest in undeveloped land, just like to have some incentives that aren't exploitative, but just the right thing to do, to sort of set aside park or the like. It feels like markets can play a role in there somehow. I'm not quite sure.
I doubt it. I really do, because markets are about money, and then money wants to increase itself.
Yeah, right.
And so how do you take a standing, let's say, forest, that has been not cut or clear cut or damaged anyway? How do you make money from that? There's no question from a biological point of view that the forest is sequestering carbon. If it could, and we used to think that, mature trees didn't sequester anymore. Now we know that actually they sequester more. So we have the amazing data from studies of forests and so forth. But what is the marketplace here? And why are they paying for that? They're paying for it because they're emitting carbon. They're emitting carbon over here and then buying offsets over there. And so it's a gerbil wheel of idiocy, because nothing has changed. Now, are we preserving that forest? Possibly, at least for the time being. But what happens when you don't get income from it anymore? Oh, well, then that can become problematic. And so the idea of a nature-based solution is the same mindset, that like nature has been the solution to everything forever. And now we're, sort of putting a circle around it and say, what's a nature-based solution? As opposed to what?
Yeah.
Like we're not nature. I mean, we're nature.
Right.
We can be a nature-based solution in that sense,
Right.
Again, it's not schizophrenic, but it is definitely emblematic of how our awareness and consciousness of where we live has been fractured by the information that comes into us, the language that comes into us, the science that comes into us or doesn't come into us. And for most people, there's very little science coming into them and their daily lives that makes any sense at all.
Mm-hmm. I was in reading parts of your book too. I was thinking back to Ed Wilson and Half Earth, and I was kind of down on Half Earth. I didn't write about it at the time, but I was down on the idea of that concept. I wasn't quite sure how it would play out and what half. Is it just that gets to all kinds of questions. And even with governments doing these biodiversity treaty commitments for 30 by 30, setting aside 30% of nature by 2030 and onward. There are all these questions about how that relates to the rights of the local people, who are depending on forests and many granular things. But lately, more recently, I've felt it is the right thing to do, to just shrink our footprint so that this thing we call the other living part of the world can just play around and be itself. And obviously it gets complicated because of climate change and other issues where it's not about acres, it's about dynamics. But it just feels like a fundamental possibility. And then even in countries that are sort of depopulating, like, have you seen the images from rural Japan where these villages are all being consumed by nature? In a way, working with those shifts in human demographics feels like it's one way forward. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I think the issue would be is the third of the Earth that's put aside contiguous, or
Right.
or we have the Lovejoy effect, which that my daughter also did a PhD following Tom's work in the Amazon, which is when you start to, draw a circle around smaller and smaller areas, certainly of forests, you get a real breakdown in biodiversity and viability. So yeah, I think set-asides would be great. I hope that happens, but I will say this, that I think our whole career in the environment and with respect to climate has primarily focused, maybe not focused, but I would say that the focus has been on top-down solutions. And so the Conference of the Party is obviously the most top-down in terms of climate. And there's a COP, for biodiversity, and there's a Conference of the Party for land use. There's 3
Right.
COPs a year, not one. And the people who go there are ministers and corporations and NGOs and experts and scientists and so forth. And they have a very tough conversation every year to try to wring out some sort of resolution. The Paris Mandate was the last one that had any real depth to it and so forth, which has failed completely after 10 years. But nature is not top down. And so top-down solutions, I don't think will work. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to get together and talk and share and understand what's going on internationally in our different cultures. But we should. That's a really good thing. But there's a kind of arrogance, or maybe not arrogance, but sort of an ignorance that somehow a top-down solution made by entities, which are basically countries whose politicians are elected in every 4, 6, or 8 year period of time, or basically elected for life by dictators, are going to solve the problem. And it's not going to happen.
Right.
Because you can't commit your country to something that is far beyond your duration as president or prime minister or whatever. It'll be rejected, because what we need to do doesn't pencil out in the short term. It only pencils out in the long term. And so, again, we just have to respect these top-down meetings and appreciate the people who put their time and effort into it. But the idea or the belief that somehow a policy, whether it's half Earth or 30-30 or the Paris Mandate, and we can go on, are going to make a difference. They're not.
No, I know, and believe me, that's come up over and over again in my reporting over the years. There was a moment 11 years ago, I think, when the Pope was in New York City for one of the climate talks, and there was this conference on civilization and climate. And I went to a presentation by a guy who advises the EPA at the time, and he talked about, he had done this modeling study, the conclusion of which was coordinated manipulation of 6 variables is necessary to ensure the sustainability of the human enterprise for the next 200 years. And in my mind, that immediately elicited an image of some master architect with knobs and
the Wizard of Oz.
And it was so antithetical to humanity, to the human enterprise, that I raised my head like a high schooler.
Yeah.
I said, that doesn't sound like the world. And he said, no, you're right. He said we have we have a moral imperative against murder, but we don't have a moral imperative against murder of the Earth system.
That's right.
And so again, it just completely belied the idea of some top-down master controller.
Well, see, I have a different way of looking at, because people say, well, yeah, but again, what do you propose, or what's your idea, or blah blah blah. And I understand that. I can only explain what I see, not what I know or I believe should be done. And also, I can describe what I think is happening, maybe, and yeah, beliefs do not change our actions. And that came from Andrew Huberman, by the way, at Stanford. I should have cited that. But when I was a youth, I lived in the Sierras, and we would have fires. California is probably the most fire-prone area in the world, one of them, and that's just the nature of drought, rain, forest. The way the geography of California lends itself to fire, and the Native Americans who lived here. There's 50 some odd different tribal cultures in California, and when who was it? I forget. In 1520, when the first ship came into San Pedro Bay in Los Angeles, it was written up, and it was called Smoky Bay, and it was called Smoky Bay because there was these pyres. That was the language used by Cabrillo. It was Cabrillo, yeah, and coming up all over, and there was plumes of smoke going straight up. Well, what were they doing? They were doing fire ecology. They were burning the brush in the winter or the early spring when it was still moist to create pasturage for animals for food. I mean, this is practical activity by the tribes at that time. And but as a youth, I lived in an area where we didn't have a lot of fire people, and so when there was a fire, then there was volunteers or people that had a minimal amount of training. And here's the boots, with the metal heels and stuff, because you would be walking on embers. And I really was never on the front lines, but in the back, cleaning up and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And getting covered with carbon and ash, and then making sure that there weren't embers. And because manzanita will create a long-lasting hardwood ember that you can't see under the ash, and so forth. Right. You'd be tamping it down and all that sort of stuff. Okay, and you were a mess. It was a mess, but at least it was out, and everybody, as a community, had done a good job. The fire people, the professionals, had been very instructive, and it was a good experience as a human experience, not as a ecological experience. But the spring would come, and so the fires are usually in the summer or the late summer. They didn't occur in the winter, which they do now.
Right.
But at that time, and then the rains would come. And then in the spring, the very land that you had been on, which was proximate to you and you knew it pretty well, there was this beautiful, beautiful greenery and wildflowers. But the grass is greener because of the nutrients than from the ash, the mineral nutrients and so forth. But you saw wildflowers there. It's called fire-triggered succession. And you saw just the normal wildflowers, but you also saw wildflowers that hadn't been seen for 40, 50, 60, even 100 years. Because the carapace of these seeds only could be triggered by extreme heat or, and so forth. So you saw a regeneration that was actuated by the fire itself. And so I think today we have the fire. The fire is capitalism, it's ignorance, it's all the things we read about in the morning, and the destruction of people, of migrants, their lives, of the truths, of the beliefs, or the promises we made as a country to others. All that sort of stuff is being shattered. We have the birth of neo-fascism in our own country, and environment. The forests now have been opened up even more for wood, for timber, etc. So what we have is damage, destruction. It's a fire. I call that a fire. What we don't see is fire-triggered succession. And that's what I was talking about earlier, Andy, which is these people, groups, communities, NGOs, all over the world, who they can be 10 people, they can be 5, they can be 50, they can be 100. They're small.
Right.
And that's the succession, and that is happening. And we can't see it. And the same thing that before these seeds emerged, that were fire triggered, wildflowers, you couldn't see it. You could dig it up and wouldn't even find them probably. And so both are happening. And I see myself as more or less trying to provide a way of seeing the world as opposed to fixing the world, which I don't think is a very good verb.
Yeah, and this is from the coda to the book, the ending, that last section, and the section on localism. There's so much value in the local, because that's where the awareness of the details of context between your relationship with your environment are clearest. As I said earlier, with the 30 by 30 conservation goals, none of that will matter if you're not building relationships around parks in Costa Rica, so with communities that depend on that land, et cetera. And that goes for any region, any context, developed world, quote unquote developed. And some great values in your book are just kind of in clarifying, be careful with terms, think about the words we use, those deep contexts, and the miscommunication in words like decarbonization. And one thing I've learned in my 2018 book with my wife on the history of weather and climate knowledge, we had like these 100 moments, and I was thinking, well, what's the common thing? What's happening through time and going forward? And what's happening is we're moving from a relationship with the climate system that was unidirectional through 99.999% of human experience. The climate did stuff, and we either got out of the way or died or suffered or innovated. And what we're doing slowly now is building a two-way relationship with the climate, which is, we're changing it and it's changing us. And it's more complex. It's not a conventional story. It's a relationship that's evolving. And again, we didn't really talk about the vulnerability side of our relationship with climate so much as we talked about the CO2, sort of our influence. There's so much that can be done locally to boost resilience, to reduce vulnerability for those who are most exposed. And when you start to do more of that, then you have a little bit more time to think about the carbon impact. It just feels like it's a better way to think about it as a relationship than as a problem to solve. Yeah. The other thing that's throughout infused in your book is wonder. I love this. You mentioned one might say the resonances and impossible harmonies imagined, deduced, and finally proven in this one research project could be compared to a symphony, which requires that voices and instruments merge. And you mentioned this Mahler piece, which I had not really heard about. The original performance had 858 singers, 171 instrumentalists, etc. And I thought we could just close out by listening to that finale. So here we go. This was Leonard Bernstein. Wow.
Well,
So there you go.
I thought you and that from the book, what we were talking about in terms of extraordinary resonances, possible harmonies, was the discovery of how carbon was created. And it goes on to say by physicist Stephen Meyer at Cambridge that the different resonances and harmonies and that were required for carbon to even exist are incalculable, and that by all rights it should not exist. And the person who put forth the theory of how carbon C12 was created was Hoyle, and Fowler and Whaling at Caltech were the ones who skeptical, thought he was a silly British astronomer, not silly but arrogant. And anyway, he finally convinced them to try to do an experiment that proved how carbon with C12 was created, and they did. And they won. Fowler and Whaling won the Nobel Prize. Hoyle did not, even though he was the discoverer of that theory. And the reason he did not is because he said, as a hardcore atheist, said there's no way to explain the existence of carbon and life on Earth without physics itself, without there being a higher intelligence. He used the word higher intelligence. And with that, he was banned as a scientist from receiving the Nobel Prize. Yeah.
Yeah, science has a hard time dealing with unknowability. Recognized unknowability, I think, is something I've discussed that in the climate context too. The IPCC reports have these conclusions about something being very likely or extremely likely, but they don't ever say it's very likely we won't understand that.
but people should actually listen to a recording of that fourth movement. That was it's fun to watch Leonard Bernstein. It must be really fun to be conducted by him. It was very fun. What an extraordinary, expressive human being. But the actual the sound of it, it arises when you're watching the symphony. You actually don't see the chorus at all until the last movement. And I remember watching with Seiji Ozawa in San Francisco, and then what you hear is like a hum, like a low hum. And you go, where's that hum coming from? And you can't. It's like there's a sound in the opera house, and it starts to get raising in volume and volume and volume and volume. It's so magical. Yeah. And then the first note comes out from a 300-person chorus, and the curtain rises, and you see there's 300 people standing behind the orchestra who then began to sing. And that's what I meant about the Resurrection Symphony, because it's a beautiful, Mahler has done a beautiful job there of, taking the listeners down to kind of a chaotic place, really, in the music. And then there is this tonality that arises, and human beings are effing amazing. And I think we're forgetting that because we see the perfidy and the venality and the greed and selfish and delusion, and we're just in our face every day. And people are just, I mean, human beings are amazing. And I just want to put that.
It's worth noting in the context of all these things we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And there's enormous potential.
Yeah.
Still. So,
and I just want to say thank you for all the work you've done. I'm not trying to, butter you up, but I mean, you have been ahead of the curve on virtually everything I write about for years. And if you found the book familiar, that's a testament to your work and your life and your ability to see ahead and then communicate that really ably to other people. I just want to thank you for that.
Well, I thank you for all that you do every day. And we'll meet up again sometime soon.
Yeah.
We were out in your bailiwick briefly. I spoke at Pioneers about disinformation. And we'll be back out that way sometime. Come to Maine. Come here to our carbon.
My daughter lives there. My daughter lives in Thurston, so I'll come.
All the more reason. Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay.
So this has been a really nice sustained webcast. It's sort of a pop-up opportunity to catch up with Paul Hawken, paulhawken.com. You can see the web link there. And please share this when we're done. The link, it becomes an archive video. And look at that scrolling bar at the bottom if you want to get in touch with me for any reason. Suggest future shows, criticize anything I'm doing, and go onward. Take care. Take care, Paul.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you so much.
And hold on if you can